You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. Joining us on the line, Dr. Gerald Horne, the African historian who holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Two of his current books are Acknowledging Radical Histories, which you can see a video of at Sankofa Video and Books, and another book called, I Dare Say, Gerald Horne Reader. And the Sankofa video, you can go to YouTube and, as they say, peruse that yourself. And how are you doing today, Dr. Horne?
Hey, it's all good.
Well, before we start, I wanted to say that today is yesterday was the birthday of the great Don Cherry, not the Canadian Don Cherry, but the real Don Cherry, the great saxophonist that played with Ornette Coleman. He grew up near the same area I grew up in. He went to the same high school, but he grew up in Watts, and I didn't grow up in Watts. I grew up in another section of Los Angeles. It's also the birthday of Delroy Lindo, a great brother who used to live in Toronto, and he was born in London on November 18th, and it was also the day that we lost November 18th, 1994. We lost the great Cab Calloway, and I want to mention Cab Calloway because I just found out a couple of years ago that Cab Calloway was a fierce defender of darker skinned black women. I mean, he actually fought promoters and people that wanted, the Lena Horne and the Beyonce types to get a full play or get all the play, pardon me. And he was not opposed to having. I guess he had the picture, the Langston Hughes poem. I forgot the name of the poem, but there's a poem about all shades of black being beautiful. So I just wanted to say that and get that out the way.
So moved.
Do we want to get into what's pressing? Let's start with Palestine.
Let us start with Palestine indeed. I'm afraid to say that the situation has not improved appreciably since October 8th, 2023, when the Israelis launched their offensive in Gaza. What we need to be concerned about as we speak is that since the Israelis are not really faring as well as some thought that they would, they may be tempted to try to lure U.S. imperialism into this conflict on their side. And in fact, not necessarily with regard to the Palestinians in Gaza, but more so with regard to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, more so with regard to Syria under President al-Assad, more so with regard to Iran. Obviously, that could trigger World War III in light of the fact that Iran has a loose agreement with both Russia and China in this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I don't think that neither Moscow nor Beijing will stand by idly as their ally is eliminated. I should also say that a delegation from the Arab League, as we speak, is in Beijing, conferring at the highest level with the Chinese authorities. We should keep an eye on that. Similarly, domestically, there has been an unleashing of vitriol and worse against the leading members of the left of the Congressional Black Caucus. I'm thinking of Congressman Jamal Bowman of New York City, Bronx and Westchester County. I'm thinking of Cori Bush of St. Louis, Summer Lee of Western Pennsylvania, Andre Carson of Indiana, who is a Muslim, by the way. And what's striking is that the Zionists what their line is that supposedly they marched in favor of anti-Jim Crow measures, and so Black people should repay the favor by supposedly defending Netanyahu's genocidal campaign in Gaza. And the aforementioned congresspersons are saying, no way. I would add further that I had thought that when the Zionists, assuming that they're telling the truth about marching in favor of anti-Jim Crow measures, I mean, a joke in the United States is that all of these people who have claimed to have marched with Dr. King, the streets would have been clogged, and there would be police officers handing out tickets if all of those claims proved to be true. But let's assume that they were. Well, I didn't think that was transactional. It was some sort of Trump-like transaction. You scratch my back and I scratch yours. As a matter of fact, objectively, I think that many of the far-sighted in the Jewish American community, not congruent, as you know, with the Zionist community, they marched against bigotry because they thought it was in their best interest, not only in the interest of Black people. And as it turns out, as scholarly studies have pointed out, many anti-Jim Crow measures like affirmative action had as its major beneficiary women of Jewish ancestry. And so they really need to stick that argument about how we supposedly owe them because of their marching against Jim Crow. They need to stick that in their ear. But that is not the only problem that we're facing right now. A more pressing problem, as you know, is the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There are credible stories about the Israelis inflicting genocide on the Palestinians. I refer you to this past Thursday's New York Times, where Mark Landler, the reporter, quoted really alarming language from the Israeli authorities, reminiscent of the language used in April 1994 in the prelude to the Rwanda genocide, dehumanizing language. For example, referring to the Palestinians as animals, with Sarah Netanyahu, the prime minister's wife, saying that that was an insult to animals. Inevitably, this kind of loose talk has bled into the society of the United States of America. Recall that just a few days ago, Donald J. Trump, who many expect to return to the White House rather shortly, referred to his political opponents as, quote, vermin, unquote, which, quite frankly, even the mainstream press pointed out that that was Nazi-type language. And then he has pledged to open camps once he's reelected, so-called, supposedly to arrange an impending deportation of undocumented migrants and perhaps even documented migrants, believe it or not. And so this is the state of play. It's very alarming, very worrisome, and there might be some offshoots with regard to this. I mentioned, I think, in our last conversation, that many of the Black politicians in New York City, Mayor Eric Adams, Speaker in waiting Hakeem Jeffries of Brooklyn, the Reverend Al Sharpton, they're all in the pocket of the Israeli lobby. But as noted in my past litany, speaking of Cori Bush of St. Louis, Andre Carson of Indiana, Summer Lee of Western Pennsylvania, not so much for these politicians outside of New York City. And just last night at the Democratic Party convention in California, you saw Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who has been running a failing campaign for the U.S. Senate, came out in favor of a ceasefire, not backed by her two major opponents for that Senate seat vacated by the death of Dianne Feinstein. Speaking of Congressman Adam Schiff of Burbank, Congresswoman Katie Porter of Irvine. And so what we see is a split in the Black leadership. And I think that what's happening is that New York City, which always had it seemed to me, a rather fanciful claim to being in the vanguard with regard to Black thought, is rapidly ceding that position to others from west of the Hudson River. But back to Eric Adams, recall that just a few days ago in Lower Manhattan, the federal authorities pushed his security aside, seized his iPad, seized his cell phones. He's in the midst of an investigation about campaign finance. The story is, the claim is, that he received money under the table from Turkish interests. He's flown to Turkey 6 or 7 times in recent years, believe it or not. I mean, he's a shady operator in any case. But the reason I bring this up is that Ankara, Turkey, under President Erdogan, has been rather fulsome in its condemnation of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I should say in all fairness that President Erdogan is known for selling wolf tickets. I mean, his bark is oftentimes bigger than his bite. But I have to draw a connection between the raucous demonstrations in Turkey against Israel, the fact that many Turks marched on the NATO base in Turkey, which houses numerous U.S. servicemen with blood in their eye, that is to say, the demonstrators. And I'm also aware of the fact that Turkey was successful in helping Azerbaijan, a former Soviet republic, albeit predominantly Muslim, in wresting away Nagorno-Karabakh from the predominantly Christian enclave of Armenia. As you know, Norman, more than most, California has a sizable Armenian American population, particularly in Glendale, in LA County, and many in the United States and many in France were quite upset by this Azerbaijani victory, which has not endeared them to Mr. Erdogan. And so this crisis is continuing. You should also know about a split on the right. I'm happy to say that we reported this on Pacifica station WPFW just this past Friday, and it took the New York Times until today to report this story. So this is one of the many reasons you should support independent media. You'll be much more up to date and much more up to speed. What I'm referring to is that according to their columnist, David French, and if he may have been listening to me on WPFW in order to gain this information, there is a split on the right. Many on the right are turning against Israel. Speaking of the former Fox News host, Tucker Carlson, the former Trump military aide, Colonel McGregor, the former CIA agent, Larry Johnson, and most of all, the Black woman, Candace Owens, who you may recall was catapulted into headlines as a close comrade of Ye. Speaking of Kanye West, he and she were sporting these neo-Nazi White Lives Matter t-shirts, you may recall, in an infamous photograph. And her comrades on the right have turned against her and the aforementioned conservative men because they supposedly have turned against Israel. And so there's a fracture on the right. There is a fracture in the Black community. There's a fracture on the left. There's a fracture in the Jewish community. This conflict is fracturing the United States generally, which makes it more difficult for the U.S. administration to execute its pro-Israeli policies. Although if you look at today's Washington Post, you'll see remarkably a reiteration of the bloodthirsty pro-Israeli policy articulated by the 46th U.S. president, speaking of Mr. Biden. At the same time, demonstrations are escalating. You had demonstrators who were beaten savagely and viciously in Washington a few days ago at the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. You had protesters raucously demonstrating on the West Coast in both Oakland and Tacoma, Washington, outside of Seattle, protesting the fact that apparently a ship was leaving with military materiel destined for the battlefield of Gaza. And speaking of the battlefield of Gaza, the Hamas forces have acquitted themselves well to the consternation of the Israelis, which is one of the reasons why the Israelis are trying to lure the United States in to this battle by supposedly the United States being able to accomplish its wider objectives of destroying Hezbollah and perhaps overthrowing the Islamic Republic of Iran. And to that end, let me also refer your audience to a stunning demonstration that took place in Washington just a few days ago, a pro-Israeli demonstration. On the dais were these so-called Christian Zionists, whose theology says that they are very curious supporters of Israel, since they're looking forward to an apocalypse that would mean the destruction of Israel, and supposedly that would deliver many of these Christian Zionists to heaven and bring the second coming of the man they call their Lord Savior, Jesus Christ. I mean, it's quite a story. And it's even more stunning that the Zionists would invite these Christian Zionists to share a platform, but also dangerously and perilously sharing the same platform were the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, the MAGA Speaker of the House, speaking of Michael Johnson of Louisiana, a self-proclaimed Christian warrior, if you ever saw one, and also given a chance at the mic was the Black attorney, Van Jones. You may recall that, believe it or not, some months ago, Jeff Bezos of Amazon had so much confidence in Van Jones that he gifted him with, wait for it, $100 million. And I guess Van Jones feels he's repaying the favor by appearing at these kinds of demonstrations, but he tried to talk out of both sides of his mouth. He came to the microphone and said, "I'm a man of peace." The crowd didn't want to hear that. And they started shouting him down with "no ceasefire, no ceasefire," which was quite embarrassing for Mr. Jones. You'll have a lot of explaining to do to those who still consider him to be a so-called liberal. But this is part and parcel of the unrest, the instability that has been inaugurated in the United States of America that will be exacerbated when the U.S. authorities recognize that they can be considered accomplices, aiders and abettors of war criminals. Speaking of Mr. Netanyahu and his comrades, Algeria and Colombia have made a referral to the International Criminal Court to that end, that is to say, targeting Mr. Netanyahu and his comrades. Perhaps the ICC, based in The Hague, the Netherlands, can rescue its tattered reputation for prosecuting disproportionately leaders in Africa and leaders in formerly socialist countries like Yugoslavia and its component parts, such as Serbia, by being legitimate or trying to go legit and going after Mr. Netanyahu and perhaps his accomplices, aiders, and abettors at the Pentagon, in Langley, Virginia, at the headquarters of the CIA, at Foggy Bottom, the headquarters of the State Department, and of course, in the White House itself, going all the way up to the top, the man who occupies the Oval Office. Likewise, the Center for Constitutional Rights, a public interest law firm based in Manhattan, has filed a lawsuit charging the U.S. administration with not living up to its obligations under the Genocide Convention. I dare say that the U.S. administration will wave away this lawsuit, but that will only provide grist for the mill for this ICC complaint that can be used to show how cavalier the U.S. administration is with regard to Palestinian lives or ignoring same. And obviously, this conflict is ricocheting beyond the confines of the United States of America. I'm thinking of France, where President Macron recently castigated Netanyahu because of his wanton attacks on women and children. This came after a plea from French envoys in West Asia and North Africa. You see a ricochet in London. The former Home Minister, Minister of the Interior, Suella Braverman, some call her Cruella Braverman because of her policy seeking to deport undocumented migrants to Rwanda, of all places. She was sacked by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak because she wanted a crackdown on pro-Palestinian demonstrations in London, which are getting ever more sizable with every passing week. It's also ricocheting in the neighboring Labour Party, where Sir Keir Starmer, you may recall, was catapulted into that office when his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, was hounded out of office on spurious and specious charges of being anti-Jewish because he was pro-Palestinian. And so we see that this crisis in historic Palestine is not subsiding. Once again, I would like to refer your audience to the U.S. military strikes that have been taking place in Syria, the U.S. submarines that are off the coast of Israel, the dozens of U.S. battleships that are off the coast of Israel, the nefarious plans that have been printed in the press about the Israeli authorities wanting to depopulate the West Bank and Gaza, send them, those folks into the Sinai Desert, and then making an attempt to undermine Egypt by building a competitor, the Suez Canal, which garners Cairo billions annually by building a so-called Ben Gurion Canal. Believe it or not, this crisis is not going away anytime soon, and we should all be in the streets. We should all be protesting. We should all be raising our voices because either A, we may be on the verge of World War III, or B, we may be entering a new international order that inevitably will involve birth pangs, that will involve the rapid declension of U.S. imperialism. You got a glimpse of that just this past week in San Francisco when President Biden met with President Xi Jinping. President Xi Jinping also met with U.S. members of the 1%, including Tim Cook of Apple, Ray Dalio of Bridgewater, a major hedge fund based in Connecticut. When he entered the ballroom, the 1% gave him a standing ovation. Now, this is going to lead to conflict if Mr. Trump comes back to office, because his strategy is to make a deal with Russia so as to focus like a laser beam on China. In that context, the 1% that are heavily invested in China may be forced, as they say on Wall Street, to take a haircut, to suffer grievous losses. They will not take that lying down, and that's going to make for a very striking presidential race in 2024.
You are listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. Could you comment on the fact that Al Sharpton was accused of helping the FBI lead, trying to lead the forces to arrest Assata Shakur? This was in 1988. Could you comment on that?
Well, I'm aware of the Reverend Sharpton wearing a wire for the authorities. As I recall, it was an attempt to ensnare an erstwhile comrade. Speaking of the boxing promoter Don King, who has walked a fine line with regard to the law. And you'll have to bring me up to speed about Matula Shakur. I mean, Shakur was in jail, so I doubt if
Assata Shakur, no, Assata lead them to Assata.
Okay, through whom? Because she was in Cuba. In other words,
No. This. Let me see. Al Sharpton she was Joanne Chassamard, is a slave name, but Ahmed Obafemi was the one who broke the news. And Al Sharpton always had a problem with Ahmed Obafemi. Ahmed Obafemi was in the Republic of New Africa, and I think he jumped out of politics and began to manage Ludacris. And we actually brought Ahmed Obafemi to Toronto many times, several times, and that's where it's coming from. But
well, yes, you've refreshed my recollection, and I do recall what happened in 1983 when Ahmed
yeah.
Spoke of a meeting Al Sharpton, and he had a bugged briefcase, so-called. It's like the movies, and yes. He was trying to get Ahmed to release information that could lead to the former Joanne Chassamard, Assata Shakur, who has been in exile on the island of Freedom, speaking of Cuba, for a number of years now. She was sprung from prison, you may recall, by some of her comrades, and the authorities have never forgiven her for that. They have tried to bribe Havana to return her to the grubby paws of the U.S. authorities, and Havana has turned its back on that. So look, I mean, Sharpton, who's done quite well for himself, he's a commentator on MSNBC, which I think brings him a hefty six-figure salary. So he's landed on his feet. But once again, I think he's on the wrong side of history with regard to this campaign on behalf of Israeli aggression.
Let me say this. I just tried to post this article on Facebook, and Facebook has been rejecting a lot of stuff that I have. I don't know if it's because of, definitely it's not personal, but I guess Facebook has an issue now where you can't post a lot of stuff on Facebook. It goes up in every other place, but not Facebook.
Yeah, that's because Facebook banned all Canadian news.
That was
so we can't post it or share it. Yeah.
Well, it's actually a bit deeper than that. I watch and listen to Syriana Analysis and Electronic Intifada, which are very useful sources with regard to the crisis in Palestine. They complain repeatedly about the fact that if they seek to upload videos from Hamas showing Hamas destroying Israeli tanks, they're rejected, they're demonetized. So they are reduced to just uploading Israeli videos. It reminds me of the fact that this demonstration on Capitol Hill with the Christian Zionists, I had sources on the ground who told me that the size of the crowd was about 15,000. The US press estimate was 290,000. Likewise, my algorithm, my feed on YouTube has been wrecked because on my mobile phone, oftentimes I choose to listen to and watch comedy. And so now my phone is just overwritten with comedy shows. I mean, it's really something. I mean, because they know that I also watch Electronic Intifada, I watch Syriana Analysis. All that sort of stuff has disappeared now. I have to make a special effort to do that. Now, if I want to watch some comic, that's easy to do. I mean, this is part of the downside of U.S. monopoly capitalism, particularly a Silicon Valley variety. But once again, they may receive a comeuppance, which I do not necessarily welcome, put it mildly, when Donald J. Trump, if and when Donald J. Trump returns to office. Speaking of which, before time expires, I choose to accept my own advice. And so I've begun exploring places for exile, including Bermuda, Namibia, Bahamas, and also Victoria, British Columbia, which is closer to Seattle than it is to Vancouver. To the extent that diasporic music has an audience in any of those places, particularly Victoria, British Columbia, I would like to receive a briefing. For example, is Victoria a headquarters or a stronghold of the New Democratic Party? I know that Vancouver is. I understand that Victoria, BC is sunnier than most of Canada, even sunnier than Vancouver. So I'll let you folks weigh in before time expires.
I don't think we're going to be able to weigh in because I think we only have 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I
but
can just mention around Victoria, BC. I've been there a few times. It's really pretty. And it's very close. It's just a ferry away from Seattle. As politically, BC is like, pretty, it's conservative and NDP, right? Like liberals really don't do much over there. And so they go back and forth. I don't know the differences between Vancouver and Victoria. I'm not well enough in out west politics to know that, but yeah, I say, hey, if you can get to Victoria, BC, it's a good choice.
I have a comrade that I used to be. Me and him were roommates for many years. James Johnson. He lives in Vancouver. He's been in Vancouver forever and a day. We can get a briefing from him.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I really love BC, the land and stuff, but it's just way too far away from the Caribbean. So.
Oh, I see.
And Gerald, you might know James Johnson. He was the president of the BSU at Santa Barbara. Maybe was that before or after you, or do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, it's well before me.
Okay. Yeah, well, he was the president of the BSU and Santa Barbara, and I think he can give you some good information. He's probably listening now. Yeah.
We'll hook it up.
Yeah.
We'll do.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll have to wait to the rest of the list till next week.
Okay, then. Thank you very much, Dr. Horne, and I'd like to thank Lisa Watson for her technical brilliance per usual, and thank you, Dr. Horne, and I'll let Melinda Francis close the show, the anchor.